Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. It starts in northwest Indiana, inside a modest home on a quiet residential street. The address is ordinary. The file won't be. Late that night, a caller to 911 reports an unresponsive adult male. Responders move with the checklist they know by muscle memory: scene safety, responsiveness, pulse, airway. The man is identified as Jason Cochran. Nothing about the room forces a crime narrative on first contact. No active struggle, no obvious violent trauma, no signs that would compel a forensic team to lock down the space as a homicide scene in real time. It reads like a medical emergency until the record says otherwise. Paramedics do what they are trained to do. Law enforcement supports a medical lead. Times are logged. Who entered and when is written down. Temperature, lividity, the basic physiology of a body at rest. Every one of those routine data points is captured. Because in American crime work, even a routine death scene gets a paper trail. This is not drama, it is documentation. What viewers rarely see is how conservative that first posture has to be. When presentation resembles a possible overdose, the system treats it as such. It protects evidence without assuming a crime. That means photographs of the overall room, then the body is found, then closer frames for anything that could later matter. Medication containers, paraphernalia if present, nearby trash, surfaces that might retain touch DNA, or latent prints even if none are expected to be probative. It is methodical and it is restrained. There is no search for a narrative, only facts that hold. Within the first hour, two parallel threads begin. The medical side asks whether there is anything to reverse, anything to sustain, or whether the window has closed. The investigative side asks who was present earlier, who last saw Jason Cochran, and whether the timeline the household can provide is specific. At this stage, the policy is to leave conclusions out of the microphone and keep them inside the notes. If a death can be explained by natural disease or an accidental intoxication, the evidence will say so. If it cannot, the evidence will still say so. But later, neighbors recall nothing unusual that evening. The block is quiet, the kind of quiet Midwestern neighborhoods rely on. That matters. Background noise is data. A shout, a crash, a car door slamming fast and hard, absent. The absence will not prove anything by itself, but it will matter when the case is rebuilt hour by hour. One of the first officers makes a remark in the log that is almost invisible until you know what you're looking for. The room is orderly. In an overdose-looking call, that's ordinary. In a homicide, that can be misleading. Good investigators learn to let a single word sit until the autopsy either contradicts it or confirms it. There is a reason you won't hear speculative terms here. No cleanup, no theatrics about blood. If the record doesn't show it, it doesn't belong in the narrative. What the record does contain at this stage is the frame. A deceased adult male, identified as Jason Cochran, found at home in Hobart, Indiana, on a night in early 2016. The official posture for the first hours is medical. The immediate objective is respectful handling, proper notifications, and a clean transfer of custody to the coroner's authority for post-mortem examination. That transfer is the hinge of this entire file. When death is not witnessed by a physician, and when the presentation is not obviously natural, an autopsy is the tool that converts speculation into science. It is also the point where a case either stays medical or becomes criminal. Most families never see that line move. In this case, it will move. Before the body leaves the residence, chain of custody begins to matter more than anything anyone believes. Personal effects are inventoried. The immediate environment is documented one more time to build a baseline. Where the body lay, where nearby objects sat, ambient temperatures that can later be used with post-mortem change to estimate intervals. If there are devices in the room, phones, tablets, wearables, those are noted for later warrant-based review, not rifled through on the spot. In 2016, investigators know digital exhaust can help anchor a timeline, but it rarely speaks in the first hours. It will be read once the law allows and the lab can validate integrity. There will be interviews, but not interrogations. Anyone in the home is asked to account for the day. When did Jason last eat? Was alcohol consumed? Did he complain of chest pain or dizziness? Were there prescriptions in play? The basics come first because they can falsify a bad assumption faster than any theory can. The goal is not pressure, it is clarity. The tone is procedural because procedure is how an agency protects both the living and the dead. Coroners and medical examiners in the United States know the public expects certainty. They also know science is not a switch you flip at the door of an autopsy suite. Cause and manner answer different questions. Cause of death is the medical mechanism. Manner of death classifies the circumstances: natural, accidental, suicide, homicide, or undetermined. Viewers who follow this channel will notice the same rule applied across cases. If the evidence doesn't reach homicide, it stays out of the homicide box. Here, the first 24 to 48 hours are about preparing for that call to be made correctly, not quickly. As for the residents, the second thread stays open. Even when a death looks medical, the space is preserved enough to permit a re-entry if the autopsy demands it. That choice, leave room for reversal, is what separates a careful file from a reckless one. If this remains a medical case, the photographs and notes become a closed chapter. If it becomes a criminal case, those same photographs will be the first pages of a homicide binder. Jason's name is not a footnote in this process. He is the reason there is a process. It is a principle often said quietly in American investigative work. Dignity is part of the evidence. You show it by keeping your language clean, your hands documented, and your conclusions downstream of the facts. The family will get answers. The method decides whether those answers stand in court. On camera, you might see a sheet, a gurney, a door closing. Off camera, the paperwork expands: a pronouncement, a transport request, a coroner's intake, a property log, preliminary notifications. From the outside, it looks like pure logistics. Inside the system, it's a chain that cannot afford a weak link. Crime work fails when the chain breaks. It succeeds when it holds through scrutiny. There is one line in the initial incident summary that will resonate later: no overt signs of violent trauma. On its own, that sentence nudges an observer toward a medical-only frame. In a lab, that sentence means very little without anatomical findings. Autopsy will answer what the room could not. If you take nothing else from this chapter, take this: first impressions don't get to be final in a professional investigation. As the body leaves the home and the house goes dark, the timeline freezes where it must. The living say goodnight to a room that will matter again soon, but under different rules. The next chapter opens not in a bedroom, but under bright lights, with a pathologist who reads injuries the way an investigator reads a timeline. The posture will change because the evidence will change it. The autopsy suite is where the file stops guessing. Once custody transfers, the case leaves the living room in Hobart, Indiana, and enters a controlled environment built to answer two questions: cause of death, medical mechanism, and manner of death, circumstance, natural, accident, suicide, homicide, or undetermined. The distinction matters because a room that looked medical can still mask a crime. Timing is recorded from receipt. Chain of custody is reaffirmed. Identification is confirmed. Photographs document the decedent as received, clothing as received, and any notable features before anything is altered for examination. Samples are labeled for toxicology. This is routine, but it is also the backbone of admissibility. If a single label is wrong, the science won't stand in court. The pathologist proceeds in a sequence designed to isolate facts from assumptions. External survey first. Condition as received, any visible injuries or lack thereof, things that might be consistent with medical collapse and things that might not be. Internal examination follows, with attention to structures that can corroborate or contradict a medical-only explanation. No dramatics, no speculation, just anatomy describing what happened and in what order it likely occurred. Toxicology screens are requested early. In 2016, labs in this region routinely test for opioids and their metabolites. The purpose is not to prove intent. It is to determine whether heroin or its breakdown products are present at levels relevant to death and to place those findings next to the anatomic record. A positive toxicology alone doesn't mean accident. It only means presence. The body still has to tell you whether the mechanism of death is compatible with poisoning, positional compromise, or asphyxial force. Days later, within the normal window for laboratory turnarounds, the results are aligned and certified. The report does not hedge. The manner of death is homicide. The medical description reflects asphyxial findings consistent with strangulation, with heroin documented on toxicology. In plain terms for viewers, the science supports a combined mechanism. The presence of heroin did not negate the asphyxial process. The asphyxial process did not negate the heroin findings. Together, they explain why a scene that looked medical on first contact actually met the legal definition of a criminal killing. The importance of that conclusion isn't abstract. When an autopsy moves a case from medical to criminal, it triggers a different set of protocols. The same residence must be re-entered under homicide procedures. Items that were documented but not treated as evidence can now be collected under warrant authority. Phone extractions that were merely contemplated become prioritized requests to digital forensics. Interviews that were light touch for notifications and next of kin become recorded, time-anchored statements. For those unfamiliar with USG standards, this is where cause and manner pull in the same direction. The cause here is an asphyxial mechanism with contributing heroin intoxication. The manner is homicide. That pairing supports charges in a way no single data point could. If the science had stopped at drug presence without an anatomic basis for force, the manner could have remained accidental. If the science had suggested force without corroborating tox, the defense could argue medical vulnerability or unrelated collapse. Here, the synergy closes those gaps. The autopsy file also refines timing. Post-mortem change measurements are used conservatively to estimate an interval of death within a window, not a minute-by-minute clock. That matters for the next phase: aligning statements, device logs, calls, texts, notifications, and movements around the house. The lab's job is not to place a suspect. It is to anchor a timeline the field can test. Once manner is certified, the coroner's office transmits official notification to law enforcement. The case now carries the weight of a homicide binder instead of a medical file. The same address in Hobart that looked orderly in the first hours is documented again with a different objective: preserve, collect, and compare. What was once routine becomes potential evidence because the medical side has proven that a human act forced the outcome. Viewers often ask why medical examiners don't name a perpetrator, because they don't. Their role is to state with medical certainty how death occurred and to classify the manner. That's all. Perpetrator identity is a law enforcement function supported by additional evidence: statements, corroborating items, corroborating timelines. Keeping those lanes separate protects the case from claims that the science was driven by accusation. In towns like Hobart, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. You hear that line a lot on this channel because it frames the stakes without adding drama. But here is the investigative truth behind it. Reclassifying a death as homicide obligates a deeper look at everyone's timeline, even the people closest to the victim, even those who called for help. That is not bias. It is process. Before this chapter closes, 2 procedural notes that help viewers follow the next steps. First, the autopsy report becomes a standing reference point. You will not hear it re-explained in later chapters unless a new finding connects to a new piece of evidence. Second, the toxicology result is now a comparative tool. If the device data shows calls or texts around the likely window of death, investigators can test whether those timestamps match the physiology. When evidence lines up too perfectly, good detectives ask if something was curated. When evidence doesn't line up at all, they ask if something is missing. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. That is not a punchline. It is a caution to look harder. From a human standpoint, this is the hardest pivot for families. To learn that a death they were told might be medical is now, by the medical examiner's own certification, a crime. The reason we keep the language clean, no gore, no speculation, is because clarity itself is a form of respect. The state now has a duty to pursue the truth established by the body and to do it without contaminating the record. The bridge to the next chapter is direct. With homicide confirmed, detectives will return to the Hobart residence under a homicide protocol, same address, new objective. They will rephotograph, collect what the first posture left in place, and prepare lawful requests for digital evidence. The scene did not change, the interpretation did. Homicide certification changes the job at the door. Detectives return to the Hobart, Indiana residence under a new authority, not to retell what the first team saw, but to preserve and collect what now carries evidentiary value. The re-entry is warrant-backed. A single log controls who crosses the threshold and when. Photographs start wide, then step down to mid-range, then to item-level detail. Nothing is dramatized. Nothing is assumed. The goal is to create a clean, reviewable record that will still make sense years later. The room is documented as found at re-entry, not as remembered. Investigators map vantage points, light sources, and sightlines. A scale card appears in every close-up image. Items are sketched and measured before they move. If linens or clothing are present and relevant, they are packaged in paper to prevent moisture retention. If hard surfaces may hold latent transfer, they are dusted or swabbed according to lab guidance. Alternate light sources sweep the area to locate trace that human eyes ignore. When there is no obvious violent signature, the method does not loosen. It tightens. In crime work, a quiet room can still hold a timeline. Collection proceeds by category to avoid cross-contamination. Personal effects near the decedent are inventoried, sealed, and signed across the tape. Medication containers and over-the-counter products are recorded with lot numbers when visible. If any sharps or paraphernalia exist, they are photographed in situ, then packaged in puncture-resistant containers per policy. Each action is written as a discrete step. The report is the memory of the scene. The team treats it that way. Digital evidence sits on its own track. Devices are identified, powered according to protocol, and isolated from networks to prevent remote alteration. If a phone is present, it is bagged in a radio-suppressing sleeve. If a tablet or laptop is on site, it is photographed before shutdown to preserve any open windows or notifications with timestamps. The forensic lab will handle the extraction later under warrant, but collection must protect the evidence now. In 2016, call logs, messages, and notification histories can anchor a day to the minute. Those records will be weighed later against the medical examiner's estimated window of death. The team rebuilds entry and exit routes. Door frames and handles are checked for latent prints if policy warrants it. Floors are inspected for transfer patterns, dust, lint, debris that could show movement without implying a struggle. HVAC returns and waste bins are screened for small items that are easy to miss on a first pass when the posture is medical. None of this presumes violence. It only concedes that small details often carry the weight when the room refuses to talk in large statements. Interviews continue in parallel, but with a narrower focus. The day's schedule, food, calls, messages, deliveries, and any visitors. Statements are time-stamped and taken as data, not narrative. If a timeline places the decedent alone for long periods, detectives look for objective anchors, receipts, camera pings from external sources like neighborhood doorbells, or routine app notifications recovered later from the device. If a timeline places the decedent with others, those hours are charted against phone movement and normal household patterns. The posture is professional, not accusatory. Investigators avoid theory and collect facts that tolerate testing. Evidence packaging reflects the seriousness of the new posture. Each bag's label includes case number, date, time, exact location within the room, and the collector's initials. The chain of custody form mirrors the bag. When items leave the scene, they leave with a destination and a signature. At the property room, a second check re-verifies seals before storage. The point is not bureaucracy for its own sake. It is court-proofing the file so that the science can speak without being challenged on handling. The second pass is also about negative findings, the documentation of what is not there. Windows intact, no forced entry, no displacement inconsistent with a medical-only scenario. Those lines will not prove who caused the death, but they limit the space for alternative explanations later. If the defense argues a stranger entered and left unseen, the condition of doors, windows, and locks becomes part of the answer. If the defense argues a fall or accident, the absence of impact indicators is relevant. Silence in the evidence is still information when it is recorded correctly. Back at the lab, the intake technician logs the scene packages and triages what needs a rush. Toxicology is already certified. Now the priority becomes correlating objects to the timeline the autopsy implied. If linens are relevant, they are tested for biologicals and for non-biologic trace like fibers and particulates. If drinkware or containers are collected, they are swabbed for DNA and prints where appropriate. The lab will not overpromise probative value. It will report what it can support. A clean report that tells you what failed and why is as useful as a positive hit. The digital track begins with device identification numbers, subscriber details, and service providers. Lawful requests, subpoenas, or warrants depending on the record. are drafted for account logs. Investigators ask for limited windows to avoid overcollection, the day before, the day of, and the day after the death, then expand only if the first pull suggests a need. If a voicemail timestamp exists near the likely window of death, it will become an anchor point. If message threads show activity inconsistent with known physiology or autopsy timing, that inconsistency will be examined. Good cases survive both alignments and misalignments because both can point to the truth. The tone stays disciplined. This is about Jason Cochran, not about building televised drama. A neighbor's recollection of a quiet night is logged again, not to pad the file, but to create a straight edge for the digital pulls to align against. In towns like Hobart, quiet is the baseline. Deviations from baseline, delivery vans, a late visitor, stand out when you collect them carefully. If a camera across the street captured a routine scene, that matters too. Routine can be powerful when the autopsy says someone imposed an outcome the room didn't show. By the end of the scene day, the binder has changed weight. The medical-looking chapter is closed. The homicide chapter is open and properly staffed. Detectives leave with a room that now has a before and an after. The before is what the first posture recorded. The after is what this re-entry documented and sealed. Between those two edges, the case will look for contact points, digital pings, receipts, statements, and any physical transfers that put people in places at times that matter. A short human note belongs here. When families ask why a team has to come back into a home once the autopsy calls homicide, the answer is simple. The first pass protected the possibility that no crime occurred. The second pass protects the proof that one did. We owe the living a careful process. We owe the dead a complete one. The bridge to next steps is procedural and clean. Coordination flags a link to a prior homicide already adjudicated in another state. That information does not become a new story. It becomes context that informs risk and urgency in this file. The Indiana case remains the spine. The focus remains the same Hobart address, the same victim, and the same timeline. What changes next is posture across state lines and the speed at which digital evidence and statements are compared against the autopsy window. Homicide certification in Hobart, Indiana, triggered a standard cross-check for history tied to the household. A hit came back, a previously adjudicated homicide in Iron River, Michigan, with a life without parole sentence attached. That file is context only. It informs officer safety, interview posture, and the speed of subpoenas. It is not proof of what happened in Hobart, and it does not replace Indiana's evidence. This stays one crime case. Indiana moved on its own facts. Prosecutors obtained targeted warrants for device extractions and account content in a tight window around the estimated time of death. Devices seized in Chapter 3 were hashed, isolated, and queued for call logs, texts, voicemail timestamps, and app notifications. In parallel, bank and card records were subpoenaed to build a money timeline that could be checked against digital activity and statements. The re-entry notes from Chapter 3 were reconfirmed. No forced entry, doors, windows intact, no displacement beyond a medical response. Those negative findings narrow alternatives later, intruder and accident theories. Recorded statements were refreshed under a tighter lens, meals, errands, visitors, then compared to third-party anchors, deliveries, exterior cameras, and early provider returns. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. The team treated perfect alignment as something to test, not to trust. Michigan paperwork arrived and was segregated under a separate tab to avoid narrative bleed. Its practical impact in Indiana: plan interviews in pairs, consider protective orders early, and accelerate digital pulls. Its legal impact is limited unless a court allows it. That discussion stays with counsel, not the case agents. Early extraction previews listed artifacts present, threads, logs, voicemails, without drawing conclusions. Any postmortem device activity or a voicemail near the medical window went to the front of the lab queue. Routine analysis also mapped household patterns, regular shopping hours, usual messaging rhythms, so breaks in pattern could be flagged without speculation. The file is now positioned for the next step. State the mechanism Indiana intends to prove, how asphyxial findings with heroin present interlock with specific items from the Hobart timeline under Indiana law. No theatrics, just elements. The meeting that mattered most did not happen at a podium. It happened at a table where detectives, the pathologist, and the prosecutor aligned the medical record with the elements required under Indiana law. The task was narrow: translate findings into charges using only Indiana facts. The file had the essentials: homicide by asphyxial mechanism consistent with strangulation, with heroin present on toxicology. Now the state had to show how those facts proved a criminal act, caused the death of Jason Cochran, and did so within the window the autopsy supported. The prosecutor restated the target without adjectives: demonstrate a human act that produced asphyxia, establish that heroin administration was part of that sequence, rule out alternative causes inconsistent with the anatomy and tox, and anchor those steps to time. This is how crime cases survive trial: by satisfying elements, not by telling a compelling story. The room mapped each element to evidence the state already held or expected to obtain from the lab and service providers: the autopsy for mechanism, toxicology for drug exposure, scene documentation for access and opportunity, and digital financial returns for chronology and context. Because the autopsy was explicit, the legal strategy could be direct. Asphyxial findings made accident unlikely. The presence of heroin did not dilute that conclusion. It supported an intentional act sequence. The team agreed to keep the medical portion one voice, one report. They would not reframe anatomy in later filings or media language. Precision here prevented the file from drifting or repeating itself as the case advanced toward charging language and later sentencing recommendations. Time was the thread that tied the plan together. The medical examiner's interval gave the state a bracket. Device extractions, once complete, would offer message times, call durations, and notification histories. Bank and card records would confirm or falsify claimed movements around the house and the neighborhood. Any voicemail near the bracket would be analyzed next to the physiological window. By design, 3 timelines would converge: the bodies, the phones, and the monies. Convergence would not be argued as a theory. It would be displayed as a sequence. Scene facts were assigned their future role. The re-entry notes: no forced entry, no window damage, no displacement beyond medical response, were not a narrative flourish. They were rebuttal material for predictable defenses. If an intruder theory surfaced, intact access points answered it. If a sudden medical collapse theory appeared, the autopsy's asphyxial indicators and the tox profile answered it. The team wrote this out in plain language for the prosecutor's memo so that nothing had to be invented later and nothing had to be repeated more than once. Digital forensics and lab processing were given an escalation order. The lab would rush a first-pass artifact report from devices, thread counts, call logs, and the existence of voicemails. Before deeper parsing, providers would be pressed for limited scope returns to avoid overcollection and suppression fights. Financial subpoenas would prioritize the bracket days. If a receipt showed an in-person purchase when the timeline placed the decedent at home, that mismatch would be tagged. If no spending appeared at all when it normally would, that absence would be flagged as a break from routine and considered alongside message silence or unusual bursts. Interview planning reflected the same discipline. Statements would be taken under record and mapped to the elements the state must prove: who was present, who had access, who handled devices, who sourced or possessed heroin. There would be no speculative prompts. Each question had to point at an element or a timeline anchor. Answers were data, not conclusions. The objective was economy: one clean ask, one clean record. From a casework standpoint, elements win, adjectives do not. The team committed in writing to a single mechanism theory: death by asphyxial force with heroin administration as part of the act sequence, certified homicide by the medical examiner, all occurring at the Hobart, Indiana residence in early 2016. They also locked the narrative perimeter. Michigan remained context only, relevant later to custody and sentencing structure, not to the proof of what happened in Hobart. A short note on respect closed the prosecutor's memo. Jason Cochran's name would not be used to dramatize a file. It would be used to keep the file honest. The system's legitimacy depends on that restraint. In towns like Hobart, people watch how you do the work as closely as what you say about it. Clear elements, clear timelines, and clean handling are how a case keeps the community's trust and meets the legal standard at the same time. The bridge to what comes next is simple and linear. With the mechanism defined and mapped to required elements, investigators will move to statements and corroboration, placing words next to the science and the science next to the clock. The narrative will not jump tracks. It will add the next necessary layer. Interviews began only after the mechanism was locked. With homicide certified and the timeline bracketed by autopsy and tox, detectives scheduled recorded sessions under standard advisements. The goal was narrow: obtain statements that could be tested against the medical window and the documented scene in Hobart, Indiana. This was not a fishing expedition. It was an element-by-element exercise designed to survive court. The spouse, Kelly Cochran, appeared on the record with rights acknowledged. Early explanations from the notification period had been vague and medical in tone. Under formal questioning and with the evidence posture now clear, her account changed in material ways. She described administering heroin to Jason Cochran and restricting his breathing. The language in the transcript is clinical, not theatrical. It tracks the anatomy, drug exposure plus asphyxial action. Detectives pressed for sequence and timing, what was done first, for how long, and by whom, because sequence would determine how the statements mapped to the medical examiner's findings. The team did not accept assertions at face value. Each admission was anchored to something that could be independently checked. If she said a dose was prepared at a certain hour, investigators compared that hour to the autopsy's conservative window and to any phone activity that could place a hand on a device. If she said there were messages before or after the event, those threads were pulled by the lab to confirm whether they existed, whether they were sent, and whether they originated from Jason's line or another. No GPS was used. This was 2016, and call logs, message metadata, and voicemail stamps were sufficient to test proximity and timing without overreaching technology claims. When statements touched the physical space, the second pass scene record from the same residence answered quietly. There was no forced entry and no displacement beyond what a medical response might explain. That didn't prove who caused the death. It narrowed what could be claimed later. Her description of a controlled environment aligned with those negative findings and with a homicide that did not broadcast itself loudly at first response. In a crime case like this, quiet evidence is still evidence. Detectives sought clarifications without editorializing. When she used non-specific phrasing, "I helped," "I was present," the follow-up was literal. What did you do? How is it done? Who initiated what? That precision was not about tone. It was about admissibility. If a single verb could mean three things, it had to be tied to one act. The transcript shows that level of care: plain questions, plain answers, time anchors whenever possible, and a return to the medical bracket whenever the account strayed from the window the body had set. Parallel to the interviews, the digital lab delivered first-wave extractions. These were artifacts lists, not narrative reports. Message threads present, call logs intact, voicemail existence, notification histories around the relevant hours. Analysts flagged any post-mortem device activity or gaps where routine traffic should have appeared. Absence mattered only when it crossed with something declared in a statement. If she said a call occurred after a certain moment and the record showed silence, that discrepancy was marked for follow-up. If she said she texted and the phone's outbox confirmed a send at the time claimed, that alignment strengthened reliability on that discrete point. The file stayed disciplined. Alignments were noted, misalignments were challenged, neither was inflated. Financial records came back in the same window. They were unremarkable in ways that still helped. Transactions showed ordinary living around the days before and after the death, consistent with a household not leaving the area or staging a late-night run. When statements touched on purchases or cash access, those claims were checked. The point was to place words next to receipts and decide where the three timelines, body, phone, money, converged without forcing them to. As the interviews continued, counsel discussions began. Prosecutors outlined the elements already satisfied in the exposure under Indiana law. With cause and manner clear, and with on-record statements acknowledging heroin administration and airway restriction, the state did not need speculative theory. What it needed was a clean path to conviction that would hold for the family and for the court. The defense requested clarity on potential charges and sentencing exposure. The state documented the range and noted that any later agreement would live or die by accurate, testable facts. A second session tightened the sequence. Kelly reiterated her role and offered time approximations that were conservative enough to sit inside the autopsy window. Detectives did not feed details. They kept questions short and specific, then checked those answers against what the lab had already secured. Where her account matched the medical and digital record, the memo reflects that match with a single line. Where it did not, the memo captures a neutral note and a plan for additional verification. The language stayed dry because dryness travels well in front of a jury. By the end of this phase, the probable cause affidavit could reference three pillars: certified asphyxial homicide with heroin present, scene conditions consistent with a controlled, non-intruder environment, and recorded admissions that place the suspect as an actor in both the drug administration and the restriction of breathing. The affidavit did not argue beyond those pillars. It didn't need to. Strong homicide files are small circles drawn tightly. There is a human point worth making once, then leaving alone. Interviews like these sit across from grief and across from culpability. Respect is not softness, it is control. Detectives kept their voices even, kept the record clean, and let the evidence lead. Families remember that long after the headlines. The work has to be good enough to answer them calmly when they ask how the state knows what it knows. The bridge forward is procedural and expected. With statements on record and preliminary extractions in hand, the prosecutor will finalize charging language and prepare for a plea discussion that reflects the evidence, not a negotiation tactic. The Indiana file remains centered on Hobart and 2016. The outcome, later at sentencing, will be stated once and only once. Next, we move into the calendar: plea, then judgment. 2 years after Jason Cochran died in Hobart, Indiana, the calendar reached the point where facts become law. In April, the prosecutor put the state's case on the record: certified homicide by an asphyxial mechanism with heroin present, a controlled interior scene, and recorded admissions by Kelly Cochran acknowledging heroin administration and airway restriction. With elements satisfied, the parties discussed a plea that would resolve the Indiana crime without risking evidentiary drift at trial. The charge was straight murder under Indiana law. The state did not seek death or life here. The statutory exposure sat in the high decades. In court, the judge confirmed rights, voluntariness, and factual basis. Kelly entered a guilty plea. Nothing theatrical was added. No new theory, no new scene. The plea tracked the medical record and the interviews you've already heard. Precision kept the file clean for sentencing. Consecutive mattered next. Because there was already a life without parole sentence from Michigan on an earlier separate homicide, Indiana needed to decide how its time would run. The prosecutor moved for consecutive service, Indiana's term to begin only after the Michigan life term. Defense counsel stated objections in principle. The legal standard allowed the court to stack sentences when different crimes in different cases warranted it. The judge set a sentencing date for the following month and ordered a pre-sentence investigation so the final memorandum would be built on certified records, not headlines. Logistics followed. Custody status remained secured. Transport orders and writs were coordinated so that the defendant could be physically present for sentencing while still under Michigan authority. Victim family input was scheduled under Indiana law. Those statements would be heard at sentencing, not used to reshape the plea's factual basis. The file stayed disciplined. No detours into collateral history, no invitation to retry Michigan inside an Indiana courtroom. What did not change was focus. This case remained about a 2016 homicide in a Hobart home, proven by anatomy, toxicology, statements, and a clean chain of custody. The plea acknowledged that proof. The next hearing would translate proof into years and clarify, once, how those years sit next to a life term already in place. The month after the plea, the courtroom in Lake County, Indiana, took the case from elements to time. The record was fixed: a 2016 homicide in Hobart proven by autopsy, asphyxial mechanism with heroin present, a documented interior scene, digital corroboration, and on-record statements. No new theories were added. The court accepted the factual basis and heard victim impact statements. Then it issued the order that ends this file. Sentence: 65 years in the Indiana Department of Correction for the murder of Jason Cochran, to run consecutive to the existing life without parole sentence imposed in Michigan. Transport and custody were coordinated so the defendant remains lawfully held under both jurisdictions. One case, one ending, no alternates. What matters going forward isn't narration but standards. Autopsy rigor prevented a medical-looking death from being misclassified. Neutral scene work, Intact doors and windows, no displacement beyond a medical response, closed lanes for intruder or accident claims, conservative digital and financial timelines place statements next to the clock without overpromising technology. Cross-state coordination let Indiana deliver accountability for this state's harm while recognizing the standing Michigan term. In towns like Hobart, that kind of precision protects trust as much as it protects a verdict. There's a human bottom line. A careful process cannot undo loss, but it can give families a clear answer that does not change with retellings. Respect shows up in clean language, tight timelines, and a single outcome stated once. I've walked you through one crime case the way I want it told. Facts first, respect always. What I carry from Jason Cochran's file is simple. Good process protects truth, and truth protects families. If you take anything with you, let it be this. Ask for evidence, honor timelines, check on the quiet people around you. Did the court get it right with a consecutive sentence? What safeguards would you want in your town? Tell me where you're watching from, or why this didn't work for you. If you value clean reporting, please subscribe and turn on alerts for the next case.